Hi everyone, and welcome to Financial Basics. Today we're going to be talking about personal inflation and how to keep track of lifestyle creep. So just as an overview, we're going to be talking about inflation, personal inflation, lifestyle creep, tracking your personal inflation and how to do that, a note on hobbies. We're going to talk about the value in tracking your expenses in this way over the long term, and then we can summarize. So inflation is the rate at which prices increase over a given time period and generally in a given geographic area, and it's a broad measure. And the way they do this is they usually just go out and look at pricing for a basket of goods and services potentially, and they say, okay, the average change in that over the last month, over the last 6 months, over the last year, that's your inflation rate. Personal inflation, on the other hand, relates to you specifically. It's your personal basket of goods and services. It's what you actually buy and what you actually spend your money on a monthly, annual basis, and how that changes year to year. So it very much depends on your individual situation and your goals, your amount of lifestyle creep, and your spending and your purchases year to year. So lifestyle creep is what happens when your spending increases along with your income, and it can reach a point when you're no longer able to save or pay down debt. So you kind of end up hitting this point where your cash or the amount that you can save gets smaller and smaller and smaller every year until potentially you're living paycheck to paycheck. Some of the things that can be often associated with lifestyle creep is more expensive housing. It's just upgrades in your lifestyle, including things like potentially eating out more, upgrading your phone, upgrading your computer, a newer car. So usually these are small hits to your overall income, but they can add up, and over several years you can get to the point where you're actually struggling. So what is not lifestyle creep? It's when you have a temporary increase in costs or a temporary decrease in your income that impacts your personal inflation rate. And usually these hit the wallet quite hard and quite fast. So having a child, if you're taking maternity leave or paternity leave, then it could have an impact on this. If you've going back to university or you're going to university, your income, you might be stepping back from work a bit, your income might be reduced during that period, and you might be dealing with higher costs, but in the long term, potentially it's balancing out. You're going to be able to increase your income on the other side of that. But in that moment, that's not lifestyle creep. That is once-off costs that are persistent for a short period of time. So for 3 years you're at university. Your once-off hobby purchases. So if you're buying something once off and it's part of your hobbies, it's not an ongoing, a monthly or weekly or annual cost, then it could potentially impact your personal inflation rate in that year, but it wouldn't be a persistent, this is now an ongoing thing. Buying a car once your current vehicle is at its end of life, then I would say that is not lifestyle creep, that's just you replacing your car. Tracking your personal inflation, all you really need is 4 numbers. So that's your income, what was your take home over that period, your starting balance, your ending balance across all of your accounts, and the total amount that you invested over that time period. So yes, just a quick example of this. So this is tracking somebody's personal inflation between 2 years. So you can see they went from starting across all of their accounts, they started on 5,000, they ended on 7,000, so they added 2,000 in cash. Their income take home was 36,000. They put away 12,000 in investments. So their total expenses, and you're deriving that number from those four numbers, you're ending with 22,000. So your total expenses in that year was 61% of your take home. You saved 14,000, the 2,000 in cash plus the 12,000 invested, you saved 14. So you saved 38.89% of your take home. Obviously, this doesn't include things like anything that's invested that is going off of your salary pre your take home point. And then you can do those same calculations for year 2 in the analysis, where he went from 7,000 to 9,000. His income increased by 10% from 36 to 39,600. He actually increased his investments because of that increase in salary. So he increased from 12,000 to 14,500. And his expenses went from 22,000 to 23,100. So what that means is his personal inflation rate was actually 5% between these 2 years. And what this did was it gave him a real increase in his available funds, in his available money, by 2.78%, because his savings rate increased by 2.78%. It went from 14,000 to 16,500. And what that means is he went from 38.89% to 41.67% of his overall salary he was saving every year. So let's just look at the calculations for that. So you can see I am calculating that completely based off of those 4 numbers. So this is an example where you are matching the inflation. So 10% was what he got as an increase. And then what he did was he increased his investments by 10%, and he increased his expenses by 10%. And the impact on this was there was no change to his expenses in proportion to his salary, and there was no change to his savings ratio in proportion to his salary. So even though he's managed to increase his investments and his savings from 14,000 to 15,400, the impact here is the buying power of that money that he's invested is worth less, or so it's worth the same from the economic perspective. And what you find in this situation is that you're flatlining. You're not really improving your overall situation, because you're not taking you're not growing you're losing against your inflation rate fundamentally. So you're not actually growing your investments. The buying power of the money that you're investing has stayed the same, and this could result in a situation where you are quite limited in the long term. Oftentimes I see people aiming for this when they are dealing with things like having kids for the first couple of years that they're having kids. That's a big one that I often see with this, where this is the goal, right? So they don't always get it because their expenses have increased dramatically, but they're aiming for it. So here's an example of lifestyle creep, where inflation was 10%. They got a raise of 10% because the company that you're working for obviously doesn't know what your personal expenses are and what you're actually doing, whether you got a 5%, where you increase your expenses by 5% or even 16%, it doesn't matter. Your company looks at the average inflation rate and says, okay, I'm giving you a 10% raise. So yeah, they got a 10% raise. They increased their expenses by 16.36%. And what that means is their expenses went up by 3.54% from 61 to 64, and their savings across their cash and their investments went down from 38 to 35. So I just want to demonstrate the long-term impact here. So this is an example of the 5-year timeline, where every year, if you are managing to beat the inflation rate and still get inflation-based increases at your employment or at your job, then what you're doing here is every year that passes where you achieve that, you're actually giving yourself a real raise. And that genuinely has an impact on the long-term finances for you personally. So this person over the 5 years has gone from 61% of their income being expenses, and just by getting inflation-based increases but beating inflation in their personal rate, they were getting 10% raises, 5% increases in their personal expenses. And you can see the impact there. They go from 61% of their expense, of their income as expense, all the way down to 50% of their income as expense, meaning they managed to increase the amount that they can save every year from 38% of their take-home pay to 52% of their take-home pay. So I just want to talk briefly about hobbies as well. Hobbies obviously have a massive impact on your personal inflation rate. And what I've learned personally is just about using your mind to really think through what you want and how to get it as cheaply as possible. So one of the things that I'm very focused on when it comes to my hobbies is borrowing things or getting it for free. So I had a real interest in virtual reality headsets, and I was looking at some of the more expensive headsets, but instead of that I decided, instead of blindly going out and just buying one of these things, I did a lot of research, but ultimately I went back to a friend of mine who also has a VR headset, and I just borrowed it for a couple of months. The reason why you're choosing a couple of months is because you also want to feel the impact of not using it. So having it sit around in your TV room or your lounge where it's not being used, and the impact on that has on you mentally, just in terms of, oh my gosh, I should use it, but I'm not. So I ended up borrowing this for a couple of months or a month or two. They loaned it to me. And I realized actually it wasn't a very expensive headset. I realized actually that kind of meets my requirements, it meets my needs, that's all I really want. And I went out and I just bought a similarly priced set to the one that I borrowed. It was about 10 times cheaper than the original ones, the higher end ones that I was looking at. And then not just borrowing, but also experiencing it as cheaply as possible is the other thing that I would say is a key point for hobbies. So one of my hobbies is astronomy. So I'm constantly looking at telescopes, looking at building my setup. Telescopes are a bottomless pit to spend money. So, and it can also get quite complicated because astrophotography requires a very different kit to astronomy, where you're just doing visual astronomy, visual observations. And I spent 6 months researching it. What was my interest? What was I more interested in? What did I like? What did I not like? How much are these things actually going to cost me, and what impact are they going to have on me? And then I decided to do the cheapest thing I could, which was go down to an astronomy club in my area and just listen to the experts, listen to people talk about their kits, their experiences. And also I got an opportunity to actually try out some of the stuff that they already own, and just compare and really get a feel for the gear that they had. And that scratched my itch. It met my requirements. It made me realize I don't need to have all of these expensive things. I can actually do with, and this is what my kit now consists of, a second-hand visual telescope that I bought and a new cheap astrophotography scope that met my requirements. And the key that I've learned through all of this is about assessing yourself and assessing who you are and what you actually want out of this hobby. And the way I phrase the question is, what is the cheapest possible way to experience what you want without spending money? And ultimately, you realize that it's the experience that matters, not the cool features or the capabilities of one specific thing that you might sort of happen to obsess over. And in general, my advice would be to use your head, use your mind to be able to experience and enjoy what you want as cheaply as possible. So a couple of examples, motorbikes. I had a friend that was looking at a really expensive bike. It costed, 20 to 30,000 pounds, and I suggested to him, go and rent a bike for 3 months. And he's using it once a week. If you're buying a bike for 30,000 pounds and 6 out of 7 days it's sitting on the driveway because it was a joy bike, that is going to drive you nuts. So I said, go rent it for 3 months. Take that hit in terms of the rental costs, and really feel what it's like to own it. And you'll quickly find, and he quickly found, that actually he doesn't need that much. He can actually get away with something a lot cheaper. Same with computers. You build up from your requirements, and then you look at adding to go, okay, this is what I absolutely need. And it's about assessing what you want to actually do with the computer. So if you want to play a specific game, go and find the minimum requirements that'll meet the ability to play that game or do that video editing, whatever the case may be. I've spoken about telescopes. Same with horses. They're a really expensive hobby, but the question is, can you join clubs? Can you join societies? Can you join groups that do horse riding or have interest in horses, or whatever the case may be? And you can tie yourself into those communities and those groups without having to outlay all of the money up front to actually potentially buy a horse. Same with camper vans. I see a lot of people going, oh, I'm going to live in a van, I'm going to travel with the van, it's going to be an amazing experience. And then 3 months in, they've spent 30, 40, 50,000 pounds on a massive camper van, and then they're like, actually I hate this, and it's actually cheaper to rent for 3 or 4 months, 6 months even, really get a feel for it, really get an experience, and then decide at that point whether you actually want to continue or not. At that point I would consider buying. Same with trucks and pickups. Definitely I see a lot of people buying massive cars, massive vehicles, and the question then becomes really assessing what you need, assessing how often you use it to actually move things around, because you always say, oh, you have a massive pickup, how often do you actually use it to carry loads, whatever the case, and then they're like, actually once a month, actually once every 2 months. So it's really easy to kind of lose track and go, well, I could actually just rent a pickup or a truck for that period, for that day, and I would be way better off if I sit down and do the maths to decide, okay, how much is it going to cost me to get a cheaper vehicle, and then rent that pickup for those days. Learning to fly was another big one that I have seen, where it is really, really expensive to learn to fly. And I had a friend of mine that was looking at this as an option, and he actually went and said, well, actually I just enjoy the experience of flying, I'm going to do gliding instead. So he does gliding instead of the flying, and that's actually a lot cheaper. So it's figuring out, looking at all of the options, figuring out what you want to do, and then going, okay, this is what I actually want to experience. And I've mentioned VR headsets as well already. So just to talk quickly on why it's important to track these measures, it gives you an opportunity to assess your expenses and see if they rose or fell over the past year, and if so, why. So during COVID, a lot of people's expenses actually fall dramatically. The savings rates in the US, for example, in the UK as well, absolutely spiked. And it was just because everybody was staying home, but it allowed looking at your expenses on an annual basis in these sorts of timelines gives you an opportunity to assess that and really figure out, okay, why did it go down or why did it go up? Were these once-off costs? There was a massive holiday. Was it an ongoing lifestyle change? I've moved house or I've moved flat, or whatever the case may be. Or was it just general inflation? Is this just the situation that you're in? And then what are you doing differently that resulted in those changes, right? Whether it's up, down, whatever the case may be, relative to the benchmark inflation, the inflation rate, how did yours fluctuate against that, and making that comparison. And what it also allowed me to do is it also allows you to go forward and backwards. So it allows you to look historically at your expenses and go, actually the reason why my expenses were higher this year was because we went on 2 big holidays, or I bought a new car, or I made a donation to charity, whatever the case may be. I upgraded my computer. So all of those things could have an impact. And then it's just going backwards and going, actually, these are the reasons. And if I take that out and I exclude those things from my expenses, I end up with a very similar level of personal inflation to what I had the previous year. So you can basically go, okay, my expenses only increased by 5% between these 2 years if I exclude these big expenses. And the other thing that allowed me to do was just look forward. And so now at the beginning of the year, when I'm doing this annual assessment, I actually write down what I expect to come up in my costs going forward for the next year, so I can be prepared for that and potentially even start saving towards them. So it allows me to pause and go, actually, these are the expenses that are coming up in the next year or two as well, or are very likely to come up, and I can deal with those in a more practical way. And then obviously, I would say the other one was the once-off costs, or the costs that are ongoing, but for a relatively short period of time, like the university, where you're paying for it, but you're paying for it for 3 years and then it will go away again. So in summary, the reason why you want to track your expenses in this way is because it gives you that long-term perspective, and it genuinely adds value to looking at your finances, assessing your finances, where you don't end up where all of a sudden you are living potentially paycheck to paycheck and you're like, how the hell did we get here? What happened? So it tracks those trends, it tracks where you're going year to year, whether you actually have more free money or less free money, and that's your savings and your cash savings and your investments. And it also potentially gives you an opportunity to just pivot out of the situation that you're in if you can project forward and see this coming, right? So do I need to change jobs? Am I living in a house that's potentially too big for me or too expensive for me? And then these are kind of the canary in the coal mines. These are red flags or indicators that you can see coming from a very long way away. And you can actually go, okay, I don't want to be in a rush to sell my house. Let me sell it now because I'm clearly living beyond my means at the moment, because my expenses are increasing so quickly year to year. So it gives you time to sell that house. Just as an example, if you want to sell that house over 12 months, then you're not in a rush, you're going to get the best price. You're going to have an opportunity to really spend some time trying to sell the house, so you don't run out of money and then go, what do I do? Let me look at my expenses, let me look at my income. You can see that coming actually from a very long way away. If you project out, you can project out 3-5 years, and you can actually go, okay, my job at the moment isn't matching inflation, or isn't matching my personal inflation. And this can be very much related to the area that you're in, right? So inflation in the UK might be 7% or 4% or 6%, whatever it is, but inflation in your location, you might be in Manchester, might be a lot lower, or in London it might be a lot higher. So you can actually take those things into consideration because none of that really matters. So if your employer is giving you a 10% raise and inflation in your local area is 12%, you might be in trouble, you might need to pivot. If on the other hand you're getting 12% raises and your personal inflation rate is 5%, or the inflation in your local area is 5%, then you're actually in a good situation, relatively speaking, even though it might not feel like it. If you like this content, please support my channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing it with anybody that you think it'll find useful. If there's anything I missed and you would like us to cover, please comment below, or you can email me as well. And if you want to discuss a specific financial situation on our channel, please let me know at financialbasicsabc@gmail.com. Thank you very much. See you next time. Bye.